Hi everyone, in this video I want to go over some answering technique for National 5 Design and Manufacture questions. This one focuses on 1D that comes from the 2018 paper. It's looking at how you would measure, mark and cut out a housing joint. Now this particular housing joint looks very much like part of a cross-halving or T-halving. It's referred to as a T-piece, so the answers are going to be very, very similar if you were asked about a cross-halving, T-halving or stopped and through housing. The only difference with a stopped housing is that you wouldn't be cutting all the way through the piece of material. So you can break your answer down into a couple of different sections. You've got the marking out section and then you've got the cutting section. To answer these questions you can use a variety of written responses, and also you're given a box down at the bottom of the page for sketching in any diagrams that you want to use. You'd also have the space at the back of the paper if you run out of space in the box or in the written response area. So before we actually write our response, what we're going to look at is a process that has more than 4 steps that we can pick from. We can choose different stages to involve in our 4 steps. There is a marking out and a cutting section, so you want to try and choose stages from each, but it's really, really important that when you're writing out your answer that you make sure you reference those workshop tools. Sketches don't need to be to the same detail and size and quality. This is purely just to make it easier for you guys to understand. So stage 1 talks about using your steel rule to measure and mark out, and it's really, really critical that you refer to measuring with the steel rule. If you just refer to marking out with a rule, you won't get the full mark. You need to mark out and measure, first of all, the position from the end of the joint, and then you need to mark your width. So you're measuring from the end and then measuring your width of the joint. Once you've measured out the joint, you're using your tri-square, so introducing a second tool, and what you're doing is you're using that tri-square to mark your lines across the top of the material. Continuing on, you're using your tri-square again, this time to transfer your lines down the short edges, the short surfaces of your material. You're transferring these lines down the sides there to continue so that you can see them positioned all the way around the material. In this case, you wouldn't need to do it on the underside because that bit isn't being cut. After that, you'll be using your steel rule to mark and measure the depth of the joint. So again, really important that you're referring to measuring with the steel rule, measuring the depth, and then marking that position. After that, you would use your marking gauge. You would position it on that measurement, that depth measurement, and then you would run it along this short edge, and then you would flip it over and mark it on the other short edge. So you want to make sure that in your answer you can refer to both of those. Last part I've referred to, which isn't shown on this drawing, is that you would indicate what the waste wood is. So that would be the area that you've marked out, that you've measured, and you would want to remove. Moving on to the cutting stage, we've introduced a tenon saw to make the cut at each end of the waste wood. So that would be that cut and that cut there. You'll also see I've included step 9, which would be to add a relief cut. Now this isn't essential for your answer, but it's just to show that in the process of removing this material, it would make it a little bit easier in practical terms to have that little relief cut in the middle. Step 10 would be to use a bevel edge chisel and a mallet to remove the material. So you'd be removing that waste wood using the chisel and cutting through it. And then the last part would be to level out the bottom of the joint using a chisel or a hand router. And just for clarity, I haven't included either of those tools there, just so you can see that it's been leveled out and it would be smooth, and that would then be the joint cut. So to go back to how we would answer this question, what we're going to do is we're going to summarise this. I'm not going to do sketches because you've seen the sketches that I've done already. You could number it, bullet point it if you want, but you do still have to respond in sentences. You want it to be nice and clear. So you would talk about, first of all, measure and mark the position of the joint using a steel rule. You would then transfer the marked points around the surfaces of the wood using a tri-square. So again, introducing that other tool. You would then use a steel rule to measure the depth of the joint. and then you would mark that with a marking gauge. At that point, I've got one mark there for measuring and marking the position using a steel rule. So we've got the initial starting position. We've then got marking the points around the surface of the wood using a tri-scale, so transferring around 3 of those sides like we talked about earlier. And then using a steel rule to measure, oh, missed out the word rule, to measure the depth of the joint and mark it with a marking gauge. That's you picked up 3 marks. They're all 3 from the from the measuring stage. So what we want to do now is introduce our cutting stages. Now, one more point would get me the mark. I'm going to add in 2 just so that we've got a really comprehensive answer. So, using a tenon saw, cut down to the depth of the joint. And then remove the waste material with a bevel edge chisel. And what that does is it gives you your clearly set out answer. It's nice and well structured. You're covering the main points, you're covering both measuring and marking out, and you're covering cutting. It gives a clear description of the stages that are involved. Like I say, you can use sketches, you don't have to. It is still a written response, so you can't use sketches just on their own. But having them along the way, even numbering them to match up with your stages, might help out in the laying out of your answer.